So Chavin de Wantar, here's an overview of the site. You can see it's in this highland valley. Some people first suggested that it was established here because it was a great kind of natural route over to the Andes. However, there are actually easier routes, so that kind of falls to the wayside. So we're not exactly sure why it's sitting here, but it does. It is situated between or at the confluence of two rivers, so that's possibly why this site was chosen. We're not exactly sure when construction first started, but it was out of ritual use by about 2600 BP. We do see monumental architecture, so you can get an idea right here. And one of the interesting things about this site is the castillo, or the old temple. And this thing is set up like that U-shaped architecture, but it's interesting because it's actually smaller than some of the things we see in the initial period. But the castillo has a main building with two wings that enclose a plaza. And what's really fascinating is that underneath this whole complex is this like a labyrinth. See, I think I have a picture. There we go. So you can kind of see what this looks like underneath. Now, in this labyrinth, we actually find the Lanzon, or the smiling god, which is possibly their patron deity, and it's called the smiling god because, again, of this particular look. So it actually goes all the way up to the ceiling to the floor, and you can actually see part of it into the gallery above. And there's actually, what's kind of interesting, an account of the Spanish of something they refer to as the speaking deity. So at Pachacamac, they would actually see something like a statue, but then a voice coming from it. And what actually happens is priests would be above it, and they would be speaking, but it would actually sound like it's coming from the figure itself. So kind of early, almost Wizard of Ozzy kind of stuff, right? The man behind the curtain. So it is possible that the priests were doing that even as far back as the Chavin Horizon. There's more evidence of hallucinogens during this time frame. We see rows of large figures, and they're all holding the San Pedro cacti. Another thing that we see emerge is this particular iconography, and this comes from a stela, and this is referred to as the staff god. So you can see the two staffs on either side, here and here, and a very distinctive headdress and so forth. So keep this kind of in mind as we move through some of the cultures, some of the later cultures. Back to the Lanzon really quick. This is kind of an interesting mix of features. We see both human, we see feline features. It actually has snake hair. Some people have suggested that the shape represents a lance or a foot plow, which is used in agriculture in the highlands. So it's possible that their main deity is kind of shaped like that. So it's pretty interesting. We do start to see, at least down in the coastal region, some more evidence of social ranking, because even though at Chavin de Wantar we see these platforms and we see these deities emerge, we don't actually see a whole lot of evidence of social hierarchies until actually after the site is no longer used as a ceremonial center. So a village is there after the site kind of falls again as a ceremonial center, and the village itself shows stratification. So those structures or houses that are closest to the ceremonial ruins have more foreign pottery, they have marine shells, fish bones. We also see the bones of young llamas, and those would be the most tender meat and so forth. And as you get farther away, of course, you find less and less of those. So indications of social hierarchy after the Chavin Horizon actually kind of collapses. But let's jump ahead to Paracas. At Paracas, we see a number of masonry crypts, and they have about 40 mummy bundles. So here's an example of a mummy bundle. And here's the Paracas kind of peninsula here. So the mummy bundles are all pretty much the same. We see an individual with the body flexed into a sitting position and then bound with cords to keep it in that position, wrapped in textiles, put into a basket, and then the basket is wrapped in plain cotton cloth and then interred, and elaborate grave goods included. So again, we're starting to see some incipient social hierarchy here. The Chavin Horizon kind of collapses around 2200 BP. Construction of the public buildings is halted. Many sites during this time frame abandoned. In some places, the architecture was actually torn down and villages built over it. We see distinctive local pottery styles develop, whereas before, in that whole kind of area that I showed you on that first map, we saw the same types of pottery. We start to find at the end of this period hilltop fortresses being built. But what's interesting, though, is that we see styles from Chavin revived later in groups such as the Moche. So the early intermediate period, 2200 to 1300 BP, is when we start to find monumental architecture on a new scale, so even more. This is a period with recurrent droughts. All of the areas that are good for agriculture are occupied. Again, we see fortified settlements, rich burials, and we see patronized art. So when we're talking about patronized arts, we're talking about a very distinctive style that helps us to reconstruct the spread of a shared ideology or shared power. So again, somebody's got enough power to say, hey, everybody's going to make this style of pottery, and that's the way it goes. So we see kind of differences in how the elite control during this time frame, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we start talking about the Moche. We're also going to very briefly touch on the Nazca and talk about the Nazca lines. We'll look quickly at Tiwanaku and Wari. So these are some of the different culture groups that emerged during this early intermediate period. So let's look at the Moche, really interesting culture. It emerges out of a previous culture group called the Gallinazo. And the Gallinazo built some canal systems, and then the Moche kind of expanded on these. So you have mud canals that come from the mountain sides all the way down into the valley. So we're talking about a tremendous amount of labor to construct and maintain these. They had to constantly be maintained so they wouldn't get silted in. So, and it's precision engineering, because if the water ran too slow, that would increase the silting, and if it flowed too fast, then there would be erosion. So we're talking about some pretty sophisticated engineering here. So here is an example of some of the canals that were constructed. And this is actually an overview of the site Sarabanco, which is kind of the main Moche site. One of the things that the Moche are most well known for is their kind of unique pottery. You can see the style, the basic style is the same as we saw earlier, but what's interesting about the Moche pottery is we see daily activities. So in some pots we'll see people fishing, we'll see people hunting with a blowgun, they might be using spears, weapons, clubs, warfare. Sometimes we can see human sacrifice. We can see some of the subsistence items that were important to them. We see different kinds of head pots, but these are probably made out of a mold, and so might have been modeled on one person but made over and over and over again. But what the Moche are most known for with their pottery is the sexually explicit scenes. This one not necessarily sexually explicit, but it does show a woman giving birth. But here we do see one of the examples of some of the sexually explicit pottery. And I had this quote, I can't remember where it came from, but it's a little bit amusing. It says, while every conceivable sexual variation is amply illustrated, the vast majority involve acts still considered illegal in Georgia. So some of them are, I don't want to call them mundane sex acts, but others are ones that people today won't even talk about in public. But it might have been that they're illustrating things that happened all the time, or it might have been sex acts that were kind of non-traditional, and this was one way to kind of get that information into a medium or express it in a way that was considered socially acceptable. But anyways, pretty interesting pottery. The Moche are also known for warfare. All of the well-surveyed coastal sites have fortresses or are fortified in some manner. We find trophy heads in the ceremonies, and a lot of the art actually depicts battle scenes. But the art actually appears to be narratives. So one of the narratives that appears over and over and over again is this thing called the presentation theme, which appears to be a ceremony. And it actually starts down here in this right-hand corner, and you have the sacrifice of captives, and whose blood is then collected in these special chalices. It's passed through a series of priests all the way through here until it's handed off to a priestess who hands it off to the warrior priest, who then consumes the blood. There are elaborate costumes, as you can see in this particular graphic, and Every time we see one of the rulers in one of these presentation themes, he's accompanied by a spotted dog. I'm not really sure what that signifies, but it must be somewhat important as it shows up all the time. At first, when they first found this, people thought it was a representation of kind of a part of their mythology until we found this burial at the site of Sipan, and it's of an individual, a male, 30 to 40